What's going on, Caffeinated Crew? This week, in lieu of an interview, I wanted to take a few moments to show appreciation to everyone who has made these first months of Beans and Breakdowns so incredible. When I first launched the podcast, I didn't really know how it would be received or if I'd even be able to find a guest for each week. But the love and support from everyone involved, the guests, friends, family, and especially everybody out there listening, has truly made this an incredible experience so far. Although I started Beans and Breakdowns out of pandemic boredom, I always pictured it being somewhat of a community, whether it was people who were into metal or hardcore or punk or coffee or, all of the above, whatever knowledge level or interest level that you're at. I always wanted it to be an inclusive and safe space for people to talk about what they think or how they feel about certain things happening within the community as a whole. This has definitely been an overarching theme of the podcast, and not just talking about music and coffee, but delving into matters of, emotions or mental health or struggles with faith and faith-based ideas, and really writing music and creating art that comes from not just a place of creativity, but a place of emotional vulnerability and mental vulnerability, discussing the things that we go through and using art as the conduit to open up about that for other people to be able to learn and grow and receive from. For me personally, that's been such a healing theme in the past year that we've had with some of the hardships that Nancy and I together have been through as a family. And that probably more than anything has really helped me kind of cope with some of the realities that COVID has created. On the coffee side of things, something I've really enjoyed is being able to dive deep and speaking with some of the roasters and coffee shop owners and people in the coffee industry, knowing what goes into sourcing and roasting some of these coffees and knowing, where our coffee comes from. Tasting coffee and brewing coffee is awesome and it's great, even if you're just drinking it to get you through the day, or if you're really learning to enjoy and savor some of those complex flavors in coffee. Knowing what goes into growing and processing and producing and roasting some of these coffees is just as interesting as the flavors that we find in a cup of brewed coffee. So I really hope that you guys as well have been, getting a lot out of those conversations. Over the past 6 months, we've had listeners not just from Canada and the US, but from all over Europe and Latin America and even from Japan. So if you're from any of those countries like Greece, Germany, the UK, Sweden, Turkey, even Mexico, Puerto Rico, Brazil, Chile, I'd like to give you a huge thanks for listening. And, if you ever want to send a message on Instagram or send an email, I'd love to hear from you and love to hear about what you think of the podcast and, some of the elements that we talk about. Now, I want to give a shout out to all of the guests that have come on the podcast so far to share a cup of coffee with me and hang out for a bit. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Harold, Evan and Phil from Whispers from the Void, Mike Parsram, Rusty Pistachio from H2O, Justin, Adam, Finbar, Kim, Ashley, Brandon, ALN from Mizmore, Mark and Richie, Nick, Taylor from Chamber, Marcus, Dominic, Brian from Death Before Dishonor, John, Luke from Yashira, Paul Wagner of Between the Buried and Me and Nightflyer Roastworks, Gunner, Derek with a Y, Mike Thorwart, Rev Kev, Nolan, and last but certainly not least, Francis St. Cyr of The Ruffians. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for hanging out with me, for making this podcast what it has been, which is a pleasure for 2021. I'd also like to give an enormous shout out and thank you to Nancy, my wife, and social media manager, media director for the podcast. She is the number one supporter of the podcast. She's the reason that it was even started and that I even pursued the idea. Nothing would come out looking as good and polished as it does without her artistic abilities and perfectionist attitude. So thank you so much, Nancy, for making Beans and Breakdowns such an amazing podcast and for making everything look so great and professional. Before we sign off for 2021, I have to say thanks to anybody who has listened to an episode, has listened to every episode, has liked a post on Instagram, followed us on Instagram. Thank you so much for supporting and believing in this community. We want to bridge the gap between heavy music and coffee, and that's only possible with you guys listening and supporting and giving us feedback on things that you like or don't like or want to see happen. So thank you so much. We have a lot of great stuff coming up, planned already for 2022. We have some guests booked already for the beginning of the year. Hopefully we'll be dropping some merch. If the COVID situation dies down a bit, I would love to be able to travel outside of Montreal to meet people at some shows. If you guys are ever in Montreal, if you don't already live here, reach out and I would love to meet up with some of y'all for coffee, meet you at a show. We have a lot of great shows coming up within the next few months here in Montreal as well, which I will be at pretty much all of them. So please feel free to reach out, send a comment, send a message, send an email. Let's make this what it needs to be, which is a community. So that's all I have for 2021. Have a happy new year and see you guys next year. And until next week, stay caffeinated and wake the fuck up.